Big waves, pretty choppy out there at this noon hour. Well, we have live team coverage. Meteorologist David Murphy is outside with the latest on these flood warnings. First, we want to go live to Action News reporter Amy Buckman in Bristol, Bucks County, with a closer view of the flooding there. Amy.
Well, we're pretty close to it right now, Sarah. We're standing between two huge puddles in this driveway, and this is just a small sample of how bad things have gotten here in the 1300 block of Minot Street. Neighbors who live on this block say the worst flooding ever that they've seen. June Smith's lived on Minot Street for more than 50 years.
The worst it ever was because Doris, who lives down the industry, called me and told me, and I looked out and said, oh my God, it's past my house. It usually comes up here and goes down.
She's talking about floodwaters from the Delaware River. Her son, a Yardley Council member who grew up here, keeps an eye on the water levels.
It's the highest that I can remember, but checking the site is the third highest ever, so, you know, it was a major flood.
The river crested just after 3 this morning. It turned yards here into lakes and damaged first floors of about a half dozen homes.
The firemen were, I guess, kicking my door and rolled out and woke me up, and I didn't know why, and I noticed my electric was out. And then when I looked out for the firemen, it was a couple feet of water out here.
Bill Clegg spent the morning trying to pump out the water, save his floor, and clean his carpets. And he wasn't alone. Along the Neshaminy Creek in nearby Croydon, residents were also dealing with water, several feet of it in their basements. And it was a real surprise since most people figured the flooding was over now that the nor'easter had moved out.
Monday, my son took off work and it was up to the third step. They were afraid of it coming up here. And then this morning, she called me this morning, and here it is again.
Back live now in Bristol Township. That's the end of Minot Street there, and just beyond the houses and the sheds there is the Delaware River. The water came all the way up through the yards, past the area where I'm standing. And the bad news, neighbors tell me, is they are expecting high tide again around 4 o'clock this afternoon. They expect this whole area to be underwater once again. Live here in Bristol, I'm Amy Buckman, Channel 6 Action News.
Not good news. Thank you, Amy. But here is some good news. Help may be on the way for flood victims in Burlington County, New Jersey. This is how things look from Chopper 6 yesterday over Lumberton. Inspectors from the Federal Emergency Management Agency have just arrived on the site here, and right now they're taking a look at all the damage, getting an assessment. It is a big step toward a federal disaster declaration, which will free up money to repair public roads and buildings. It will also provide low-interest loans to help homeowners and businesses recover from uninsured losses. Now let's switch live to meteorologist David Murphy with the latest from AccuWeather on these flood warnings still in effect, David, for parts of South
Sarah,
Jersey.
I know a couple of days after the nor'easter is gone, we're still experiencing flooding problems both on the Delaware and on creeks and streams, and that's where I want to start. The latest flood warnings that we have in the region include the Rancocas Creek in Burlington County. Minor flooding along that waterway at this point, but it looks like that will continue now until tomorrow afternoon. In the meantime, flood warnings have been extended in Atlantic, Cumberland, and Salem counties until 9 o'clock tonight. That's because of continuing minor flooding along the Great Egg Harbor River and the Morris River. And again, both of those warnings may go off the board later on tonight, but we'll have to wait and see about that. Now we turn our attention to the Delaware River. As Amy Buckman just reported, we have had problems with tidal flooding during times of high tide this morning. And you know, Sarah, a lot of people may not realize that the Delaware River and lots of its tributaries are tidal in nature. Just like the ocean, they have a couple of high tides every day. The next high tide coming at the mouth of the Cooper River at 4:13 this afternoon, at the mouth of the Rancocas Creek at 5:14. Bristol Township, where Amy just told us we're having problems, probably between 4 and about 4:52 from the river inland to some of those neighborhoods she was reporting on. In there is when you're going to have high tide. And then Trenton 5:12. We're expecting the high tides to probably run about 6 inches below where they were earlier this morning, but that still could be enough to slop those river water up over the banks and give some of those folks some more problems. A quick look at satellite and radar. Not a lot going on out there as expected. A closer look on Storm Tracker 6 live radar. The only rain we have now is very light into the south of Philadelphia. The weekend still looks great, Sarah.
Action News HD, the first to go high def. Action News, Delaware Valley's leading news program, with Dave Roberts, Rick Williams, and Monica Malpass.
The Delaware River is making house calls. Basements are flooded for the second time in a week, and the situation could get worse before it gets better. It is Thursday night. Rick's off. Lisa Thomas-Laurie joins us this evening. And the big story on Action News is another flooding scare for folks who live near a handful of creeks and rivers. The action came in Vineland, New Jersey today, where water from the Maurice River was covering roads and washing away front yards. The water has not receded since this past weekend's nor'easter. Water from upstream and high tides are just making things worse. And a similar situation along the Delaware River. Action News reporter Sarah Bloomquist live in Bristol Township with that story tonight. Good evening, Sarah.
Good evening, Monica. The floodwaters receded here this afternoon, and now they are back. And it's been quite a sight to watch the water rising this afternoon. Believe it or not, about 2 hours ago, we could walk all the way down the end of this street, past that White House, on a clear, dry street. Then at about 3 o'clock, the floodwaters came over the edge of the Delaware River, over the street, completely covering it up. Now, the residents have been here watching it all with us closely. They have good reason to. Overnight, they had to be evacuated when floodwaters took them by surprise. Doris Bronson spent the afternoon with binoculars in hand, keeping a close eye on the nearby Delaware River.
I have to. It gets pretty bad. I mean, it goes all the way up the street.
About 3 a.m., the Delaware did rise up right over its banks.
I looked out the window and there it was. 3 feet of water, and then she was really rushing in.
Emergency crews rushed to evacuate residents from the rising water.
The firemen were, I guess, kicking my door and reeled out and woke me up, and I didn't know why. And I noticed my electric was out. And then when I looked out for the firemen, it was a couple feet of water out here.
Today, residents cleaned up carpets and called in insurance adjusters to check out the damage from the flooding they call the worst in some 50 years.
And I looked out and said, oh my God, it's past my house. It usually comes up here and goes down.
Late today, the water was rising again, bubbling up through the cracks, quickly covering up the street in the blink of an eye.
They are expecting us to have more flooding, almost like we had 3 o'clock this morning, but not quite as bad.
Now, he is talking about the next high tide overnight. Flooding is expected much worse than what you're looking at right now. In fact, the township has already enacted its emergency phone alert system. As for this high tide, as you can see, yes, the water did in fact come up, but not quite as far, not what residents here consider to be the worst. Live in Bristol Township, I'm Sarah Bloomquist, Channel 6 Action News.
Thank you, Sarah.